Hi, my name is Chase Hampton. Um, I'm an ex-music technology student at the Academy of Contemporary Music in Oklahoma. I am a black artist in electronic music, and Dustin asked me to speak on black representation in electronic music. So, really what I want to talk about is how subversive the influence to and from black artists pay with electronic music. And the first artist I really want to talk about is Sly Stone. Sly and the Family Stones, There's a Riot Going On, is one of the earliest albums to use a drum machine. Specifically, I think like an early predecessor to the CR78. So it's a very preset driven groove box, can't edit the sounds, but it was a crazy sound at the time, like massive. And that's besides the rest of the dark timbres of the keyboards and early synths that you could find on that album. And for the past few years, I've always thought about how big that album is for me, in terms of like the beginnings of electronic music, the beginnings. Um, there's an album by someone named Otis G. Johnson, recorded in 1978, called Everything God Is Love 78. And this is another one of those early technology. Um, it's like a one of those like early home keyboards with those preset drum rhythms, really, really even more basic sounding than There's a Riot Going On. Extremely low fidelity. And it's just this guy singing to himself with a little drum machine and his very low quality synthesizer, the spirituals that he made up. And it's a very amazing album to me. Um, that's got to be one of the earliest true black electronic records that I can think of. Although 78 might seem a little late to some people. But around the same time, Headhunters came out just 5 years earlier, and while that may not be a totally electronic album, I would definitely argue that Herbie Hancock's uh, Arp Odyssey solo in Chameleon has got to be one of the greatest solos of any instrument ever, probably the greatest synth solo ever. The way he morphed from a intonality solo to this wild, amorphous, atonal, shrieking beast on a jazz fusion record. It's really impressive. And that leads me to another point in that Herbie Hancock is the pioneer, the mainstream pioneer of black representation in electronic music. That dude was always on the cutting edge, and I love him for it. Without Herbie Hancock, I mean, where are we? Where are we? There's a really wonderful video that I'm going to link to Dustin, and I hope he shares it with you guys. And it's Herbie Hancock and Quincy Jones playing on a Fairlight CMI and Rhodes Chroma. Now, the Fairlight CMI, as we know, is like one of the first major samplers ever made. And a lot of people attribute this instrument to Kate Bush and Peter Gabriel. You know, those are the big names when we think of people who use the Fairlight. But Herbie Hancock was right there with them. He made Rocket on it, and he made this video where they were being interviewed, him and Quincy. They're having a drink, and they made this really amazing jam where they program using the sequencer on the Fairlight. You know, you see them tapping the screen, and they program the sequence into it. And then Herbie hops on his Rhodes Chroma Polara, and he just starts soloing. And it's really amazing. And there's two amazing quotes in that. One of them in which is the interviewer asks something of Quincy, something like, "So the African blood still raises its head, and the way you guys use that instrument." And you know, Quincy laughs and says, "The funk will prevail," and the funk will prevail no matter what, in many different ways. With black representation, with black music, black art, funk will prevail. That is really what drives our hearts and has driven our hearts for hundreds of years. And after this, Herbie gives a little bit more of an interview where he speaks on the importance of seeing instruments as tools and how you can do different things with them. And that's putting it lightly. You really have to watch that video. It's incredible. Around this time, the mid-70s to the late 70s, there was a band that I think is a little underappreciated in the East named the Yellow Magic Orchestra. And their first couple albums, they were very heavily inspired by American funk and also like Michael Jackson kind of pop. Now, Michael Jackson actually wanted to use their song Behind the Mask on Thriller, but they didn't clear the rights for it eventually. And they took this black influence from black artists, and they ended up making some of the greatest synth pop to ever be made. They're one of my absolute favorite artists, and their songs in turn inspired hip hop. A lot of hip hop artists, those early guys like Afrika Bambaataa, would sample YMO and Kraftwerk records, and that's what I mean about how even when an artist like Yellow Magic Orchestra takes influence from black artists, they feed it right back into black art. It goes right back to hip hop. Yellow Magic Orchestra also had a song called Rap Phenomena, and that's like one of the earliest rap songs, especially out of the United States. Now, I'm not going to tell you it came before like Rapper's Delight. That's not true. But it was one of the earliest non-United States rap songs. And there's just this feedback of inspiration and influence. And that's really why I like artists like that. Now, when I talk about samplers, Herbie, Yellow Magic Orchestra, they were both coming into these early samplers at the same time. But in addition to them, people who would come at a later time would begin sampling. And not too much later, like a few years, like early mid-late 80s. You know, that's when you first start getting, instead of like, oh, we played one record on loop, like Rapper's Delight, you get more nuanced sampling. And this isn't what this is about, but sampling arose in terms of hip-hop. Its core arose because of their inaccessibility to expensive instruments. You know, they could no longer afford to be jazz musicians, to be rock musicians, so they turned to things like sampling because all they had was their records. All they had was their own music, and they transformed that into different art. And that's why hip-hop is beautiful. But I don't have to tell you that, and that's not what this is about. I'm just saying, at the same time, you had people like Herbie Hancock and Yellow Magic Orchestra had their hands on samplers as well. And that leads back to, it's a tool. It's a tool, and it's how you use it. Now, a little bit later, after all this, late 80s, comes Detroit techno, house music. House music may have been a little earlier. Now, house music arose out of black and LGBT communities. It was about the representation. It was about the environment of safety in the clubs. It was an underground identity. Now, at the same time, disco was too. And disco was, there was the great disco burning fiasco. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that disco was associated with black and LGBT communities. So when that music was thrown away for hair metal, those communities held on to that, and that's how you get stuff like house music. Now, artists like Yellow Magic Orchestra, Kraftwerk, they also fed back into techno music, because in the late 80s, in the 80s in general, actually, this is how they all mastered these instruments. The Yamaha DX7 comes out, so everyone hops on the digital synthesis trend. Because of digital synthesis, everyone started throwing away their analog synthesizers for nothing, which would make all of us laugh nowadays. But because of that, that's how we lead to artists in the house and techno scenes. They get a hold of these cheap, incredible instruments, and they start making their own music with it. They get inspired from music from the East, like Germany and Japan, and that's where techno comes from. And house kind of takes a little bit from that with the roots of disco. And one thing I really want to point out is late 80s, early 90s Detroit techno is Aphex Twin. They invented ambient techno. Um, I have two examples. One is Neutron 9000's track Butterfly Holocaust sounds almost exactly like Pulse Width on Selected Ambient Works 8592 by Aphex Twin. In addition to that, Carl Craig's releases around the time under the pseudonyms of Psyche and BFC. It's just Selected Ambient Works 8592. That's exactly where Richard D. James got his inspiration from, was digging these records from the West, from over the seas, from black communities. It just feeds back into each other. It just feeds back into each other. Now, Richard would go on to become the most famous artist in the IDM scene, which would then inspire artists like Flying Lotus to make their own black brand of American IDM. And it's just this continuing loop. At the same time, one of Aphex Twin's contemporaries, Boards of Canada, they established their own section within electronic music by taking influence from American hip-hop, from black music. They realized how much of importance those big booming sampled drums were because they listened to hip-hop. And so all the beats in these Boards of Canada songs are just almost boom bap beeps. And you see where it's all a cycle. It is all entirely a cycle. A lot of my tastes in music, my influence revolves around this cycle. Yellow Magic Orchestra, Akiko Yano, Aphex Twin, Boards of Canada, Sly Stone, Herbie Hancock, Carl Craig. These are all just a few people, and they all feed off of each other. And there's many more. There's many more. And it just goes to prove to you that black music is this continuous tree that grows from inspiration and creativity. And you can really go back in time. You can really go back in time to where this all comes from. Black music is, without black music, I don't see what music there is. All modern music has more roots within black art, black history, than it does classical European 12-tone tonality. I mean, just the experimentation that arises from these situations that black communities are. It all revolves around the recycling of what they can use because they don't have access to the latest and greatest. They don't have access to the expensive things. And that's how you get techno. That's how you get hip-hop. And this leads me to one of the most important resources. If there's one resource I want to pass on to you people, it's going to be AfroRack. It is a organization within Chicago that does work to introduce young minority communities, young poor communities to modular synthesis, which, as we know, modular synthesizers are a very chic, expensive brand of electronic music. It feels inaccessible to a lot of people, especially people who are poor, many of which you happen to be. It's inaccessible to a lot of people, people who are poor, many of which you happen to be black people, people of color. So AfroRack is a very, very good resource, a very good organization that I would like to put my name behind because they introduced these black communities, these poor communities to modular synthesizers. If there's one last thing that I can pass on to educators, I would like you to think about the underrepresentation and acknowledgement of black people's place in electronic music. I'd like you to acknowledge the feeling of a lack of belonging that many black people and other people of color feel and experience within the electronic community and education. I go on YouTube, most people who review synthesizers, who talk about electronic music, are white dudes. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it'd be nice to see somebody like me. You know what I mean? Somebody like me. So, what you need to do, if you have a person of color, if you have a black person, and you're in a position to foster their education, I want you to let them know that they belong, that they're in the right place, and you need to help fertilize their passion for our music community. You don't want to, chase them off. You don't want to chase them off to something else. They belong. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.